Grandma, I need to tell you about something that happened last week that's been keeping me awake at night. Something about love, shame, and what it means to truly know someone. You always said that a person's character shows most clearly in their final moments, and Lord, were you right about that. Victoria Chen stood in the marble hallway of the Blackstone Memorial Hospital's private wing, her hands trembling as she held the divorce papers she'd never had the courage to serve. 43 years old, still beautiful despite the weight of 20 years carrying a secret that had slowly crushed her spirit. The papers were dated 3 months ago, the same day she'd finally decided she couldn't live as a ghost in her own marriage anymore. But now, Jonathan Blackstone was dying. The man who'd loved her in shadows, who'd built her a separate world of private jets and hidden homes, who'd whispered "my heart" in 5 different languages but never once said "my wife" in public, was asking for her. Not his children from his first marriage, not his business partners, her. Mrs. The nurse hesitated, not knowing what name to use. Even here, in this moment, Victoria existed in the space between identities. Chen, Victoria said quietly, the name feeling like armor and wound all at once. Victoria Chen. Grandma, you would have seen right through that hesitation. You always could spot when someone was carrying a truth too heavy for their shoulders. Part 2, Character Foundation. Let me tell you about Jonathan first, Grandma, because understanding him is understanding how love can be both the most beautiful and cowardly thing in the world. Jonathan Whitmore Blackstone wasn't born into money. He'd clawed his way up from a trailer park in Ohio, building his tech empire with the kind of ruthless determination that comes from never wanting to be powerless again. By 55, he was worth $8 billion and carried himself like a man who'd forgotten what it felt like to be afraid. But when he'd met Victoria 20 years ago at a charity gala in San Francisco, something in her quiet strength had brought that scared boy right back to the surface. She'd been working as a translator for the Chinese delegation, elegant in a way that didn't announce itself, brilliant in a way that didn't need an audience. When she'd corrected his Mandarin pronunciation with a smile that held no judgment, only gentle amusement, Jonathan had felt something crack open in his chest that he thought was permanently sealed. "You make it look easy," he'd told her later that night over coffee that stretched until dawn. She said, "Nothing worthwhile is easy." And Grandma, I think that's when he knew he'd found his match. They'd married 6 months later in a small ceremony in Carmel. Just them, a judge and 2 witnesses they'd pulled from the street. Victoria had worn her mother's jade bracelet and a simple white dress. Jonathan had cried when she'd promised to love him not despite his flaws, but including them. But here's the part that would break your heart, Grandma. Jonathan never told his children about the wedding. Victoria understood at first. His son Marcus, was still angry about the divorce from Jonathan's first wife. His daughter Sarah was protective, suspicious of any woman who came into their father's life. "Give it time," Jonathan had said. "Let them get to know you first." Time turned into years. Years turned into a lifetime of separate holidays, of Victoria watching Jonathan's family from across rooms at public events, of being introduced as a close friend, until the lie became a prison for them both. And Victoria, beautiful Victoria, had let it happen because she'd loved him more than she had loved herself. If anyone listening has ever loved someone who couldn't quite love you back in the way you deserved, leave a comment below. Sometimes sharing our truth helps us heal. Part 3, The Inciting Incident. The call had come at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday in October. Victoria had been in their Malibu house, the one that Jonathan had bought for her under the name Chen Holdings, the one where his children had never set foot. "Mrs. Chen?" The voice belonged to Dr. Patricia Hayes, Jonathan's longtime physician. "I'm sorry to call so late, but Mr. Blackstone has had a massive heart attack. He's stable, but you should come." Victoria drove through the night in Jonathan's Tesla, the one he'd programmed with her biometrics so she could use it freely but never registered in her name. Everything in their life existed in this strange liminal space, real but not official, loving but not acknowledged.
She'd arrived at the hospital to find Jonathan's children already there. Daniel, now 32 and carrying his father's stubborn jaw, stood vigil with his arms crossed. Sarah, 28 and sharp as her father had been in business, paced the waiting room like a caged predator. Neither of them acknowledged Victoria when she walked in, though she'd been at every birthday party from a distance, had bought presents that Jonathan gave without mentioning her name, had learned their favorite foods and allergies and dreams through his stories. "Excuse me," Sarah had said when Victoria approached the reception desk, "I think there's been some mistake. This is a family-only area." The words had hit Victoria like a physical blow. Grandma. 20 years of being erased, and she still wasn't prepared for how much it could hurt. Victoria had started, then stopped. What could she say? That she was legally family? That she'd held Jonathan through panic attacks about losing his children's love? That she'd been the one to encourage him to stay involved in their lives, even when it meant she had to disappear? Dr. Hayes had appeared like an angel, her face grave. "The patient is asking specifically for Victoria. I'm sorry, but those were his explicit instructions." And that's when everything Jonathan had built, every careful separation, every protective lie, started to crumble. Part 4. Rising Tension. "Grandma, you always said that secrets are like water damage. They seem small until suddenly the whole structure gives way. That's what happened in that hospital corridor." "Victoria?" Daniel had repeated the name like he was trying to place it. "The translator from Dad's work events?" Sarah's eyes had narrowed with the kind of intelligence that missed nothing. "The woman who's been at every company Christmas party for 15 years but never brings a date." Victoria felt exposed, like all her careful invisibility was being stripped away layer by layer. She'd become so practiced at being a ghost that being seen felt almost violent. "I should go," she had whispered, but Dr. Hayes had caught her arm. "He's been asking for you for 3 hours, the doctor said gently. "He won't let us treat him properly until he sees you." And there it was. Even dying, Jonathan was still trying to control the story, still trying to keep his two worlds from colliding. But love, Grandma, love has its own gravity. It pulls everything toward the truth eventually. Victoria had walked into Jonathan's room like she was walking to her own execution. He looked so small in that hospital bed, this man who'd commanded boardrooms and moved markets. The machines beeping around him sounded like time running out. "Victoria," he'd breathed, and his whole body had relaxed, like she was medicine. She'd taken his hand, wedding ring to wedding ring, though no one looking would understand the significance. "I'm here." "The papers," he'd whispered, eyes flicking to her purse where the divorce documents waited. "Did you—" "No," she had said simply. "I couldn't." He'd closed his eyes, and tears had leaked out the corners. 20 years I've been a coward. 20 years I've loved you like my life depended on it and been too afraid to let the world see." Outside the room, Victoria could hear Daniel and Sarah demanding answers from nurses, their voices rising with each non-answer they received. The truth was a tide coming in, and there was nowhere left to run. "Jonathan," Victoria had said softly, "maybe it's time." But he'd already fallen back into unconsciousness, leaving her alone with the weight of their secret. Have you ever been in a situation where telling the truth felt impossible, but living the lie felt like dying? Share your story in the comments. You're not alone. Part 5. The Midpoint Revelation. This is where the story gets complicated, Grandma, because love isn't always noble and people aren't always brave when they need to be most brave. Victoria had been sitting by Jonathan's bedside for 6 hours when Sarah finally cornered her in the hallway. The younger woman moved like her father, direct, purposeful, ready for a fight. "Who are you? And don't give me that translator story again. Translators don't get called at 3 a.m. when someone has a heart attack." Victoria had looked at this young woman, brilliant, fierce, carrying her father's eyes and her mother's protective instincts, and felt her heart break all over again. This could have been her stepdaughter, should have been. In another life, one where Jonathan had been braver, they might have been family. "I'm someone who loves your father," Victoria had said quietly.
That's not an answer. It's the only answer that matters. Daniel had appeared then, looking exhausted and confused. The doctor said he's been listing you as his emergency contact for 15 years, his primary contact, before us. And there it was, one of Jonathan's secrets spilling out like blood from a wound. He'd loved Victoria enough to trust her with his life, just not enough to trust his children with their love. "I need to know," Sarah had pressed. Are you together? Like together? Victoria had opened her mouth to give the careful non-answer she'd perfected over 2 decades, but something in Sarah's face had stopped her. The young woman looked scared, Grandma, not angry. Scared, like she'd been missing pieces of her father's life and was only now realizing how much. "Yes," Victoria had said simply. "We're married." The silence that followed felt like the moment after lightning, when you're waiting for the thunder that's going to shake everything apart. "Married?" Daniel had repeated slowly. "You're married to our father?" "For 20 years. Sarah had sat down hard in a plastic chair, all her fight draining out at once. 20 years? You've been married for 20 years and we never... "He was protecting you," Victoria had said quickly. "He didn't want to disrupt your family, your relationship with him. Your mother had just died when we met, and you were both so young, and he thought..." "He thought what?" Sarah's voice had cracked. "That we were too fragile to handle him finding love again? That we would have stopped loving him if he'd been happy?" Victoria had no answer for that, because the truth was too complicated and too painful. Jonathan had been protecting himself as much as his children, afraid that love was finite, that choosing her meant losing them, that happiness was something he didn't deserve to have completely. "Does he love you?" Daniel had asked suddenly. The question had come out raw, like it had torn something inside him to ask it. "Yes," Victoria had answered without hesitation. "And I love him, more than anything." "Then why didn't he tell us?" And Grandma, that's the question that haunts me about this whole story. Why do we hide the things that matter most? Why do we save our love for the shadows? Part 6. The Darkest Hour. 3 days later, Jonathan took a turn for the worse. The doctors said his heart was failing, that they'd done everything they could. It was time for family to say goodbye. But what was family? Victoria had been his wife for 20 years, but his children had been his blood for a lifetime. The law said she had the right to make medical decisions, but love said they all deserved to be there. Victoria made a choice that I think you'd be proud of, Grandma. She'd called Daniel and Sarah herself. "He's dying," she said simply. "Whatever else is complicated between us, he loves you both more than life itself. You should be here." They'd all gathered in his room as the sun set over Los Angeles, casting everything in gold light that made even the sterile hospital feel holy. Jonathan drifted in and out of consciousness, but whenever he was awake, his eyes found Victoria first, then his children. "Dad," Sarah had whispered, taking his other hand, "we know about Victoria. We know she's your wife." Jonathan's eyes had widened, then filled with tears. "I'm sorry," he'd breathed. "I'm so sorry I kept you apart." "Why?" Daniel had asked, and it wasn't angry anymore, just heartbroken. "Why didn't you trust us?" Jonathan had struggled to speak, each word costing him. "Lost your mother, couldn't bear to lose you, too." And that's when Victoria understood the truth that had been hiding under 20 years of secrecy. Jonathan wasn't ashamed of her, he was terrified that love was finite, that choosing her meant losing them, that happiness was something he didn't deserve to have completely. "You never could have lost us," Sarah had said, crying now. "We just wanted you to be happy." But it was too late for could-haves and should-haves. The machines were showing what they all knew. Jonathan was leaving them. Victoria had leaned close to his ear. "I forgive you," she'd whispered, "for all of it. I forgive you." His grip on her hand had tightened one last time, and then he was gone. If you've ever lost someone while there were still things left unsaid, know that love transcends our mistakes. Leave a heart in the comments if this story is touching you.
Here's where the story changes, Grandma, where it becomes about more than just loss. The funeral was set for the following Friday at St. James Cathedral, the kind of grand affair befitting a billionaire philanthropist. Jonathan's will had been clear about one thing. Victoria was to be acknowledged as his widow and given full honors as such. But the morning of the service, Victoria had made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. She'd called Daniel and Sarah. "I won't be sitting in the front row," she told them. "This is your day to grieve your father publicly. I've had 20 years to love him privately." "Victoria, no," Sarah had protested. "You're his wife. You belong." "I belong where I choose to belong," Victoria had said gently. "And I choose to honor his memory by putting his children first, the way he always did." But Daniel had surprised her. What if we want you there? What if we need you there? And that's when Victoria had realized that Jonathan's greatest fear, that love was finite, had been wrong all along. Love multiplies when it's shared. It grows when it's acknowledged. She'd gone to the funeral, but not alone. Daniel had picked her up, and Sarah had insisted on riding with them. They'd sat together in the front row, not because protocol demanded it, but because grief had made them family in a way 20 years of secrecy never could. When Victoria had been invited to speak, she'd stood at the podium and looked out at 1,000 faces, business associates, politicians, celebrities, all the public Jonathan that she'd never really known. Jonathan Blackstone was a complicated man. She'd begun her voice steady despite her breaking heart. He was capable of extraordinary love and extraordinary fear, often at the same time. He built an empire, but what I'll remember is how he made tea every morning for 20 years, how he cried at sad movies, how he worried constantly that he wasn't good enough for the people he loved most. She'd looked at Daniel and Sarah, sitting in the front row with tears streaming down their faces. He was afraid that love was a finite resource, that choosing happiness might cost him the relationships that mattered most. But love isn't finite. Love is the only thing that multiplies when you share it. And Jonathan had so much love to give to his children, to his work, to me, to anyone who needed it. His only mistake was thinking he had to choose. After the funeral, Victoria had done something that shocked everyone. She'd invited Daniel and Sarah to the Malibu house, their father's other home, the one they'd never seen. "This is where he was happiest," she'd told them, as they walked through rooms filled with family photos that included them, pictures Jonathan had asked for copies of, memories he'd treasured in private. Sarah had stopped in front of a photo from her college graduation. "He has a copy of this," she had said. "He has copies of everything," Victoria had said softly. "Your birthday parties, Daniel's wedding, every Christmas, every achievement. He kept albums and albums of your lives." They'd found Jonathan's study, where he'd kept letters he'd written to both of them but never sent. Apologies, explanations, expressions of love that he'd been too afraid to voice. Daniel had read one out loud, his voice breaking. "I know I failed you by not being braver. I know hiding Victoria has hurt all 3 of the people I love most, but I just didn't know how to risk everything. I'd already lost everything once. But you deserve better than a coward for a father, and she deserves better than shadows for a life." He was going to tell you, Victoria had realized, looking at the dates on the letters. These are all recent. He was working up the courage. That's when Sarah had done something extraordinary, Grandma. She'd hugged Victoria, really hugged her, like she meant it. "I'm sorry we never got to know you," Sarah had whispered. "I'm sorry he kept you from us and us from you." "We lost 20 years, Daniel had added, "but we don't have to lose any more." And Victoria had felt something she hadn't experienced in decades, the sensation of being chosen, not despite the circumstances, but because of them. These young people, her husband's children, were choosing her as family. If this story is reminding you to reach out to someone you've been meaning to connect with,
Take it as a sign. Like this video if you believe love can heal even the deepest wounds. Part 8. Climactic Resolution. 6 months later, Victoria stood in that same Malibu house, but it felt completely different now. Daniel and Sarah visited every Sunday for dinner, a tradition that had started tentatively and grown into the highlight of Victoria's week. She'd learned that Daniel had his father's gift for business, but his mother's compassion. That Sarah had inherited Jonathan's intensity, but used it to fight for social justice. That both of them had grown up feeling like they knew only parts of their father, and now, through Victoria's stories, they were meeting him whole for the first time.
Victoria had also made changes. She'd started using the name Victoria Blackstone, not because she needed Jonathan's name to define her, but because she was proud to have been his wife. She'd taken over his charitable foundation, working with Daniel and Sarah to expand it into areas Jonathan had only dreamed of touching. But the most important thing, Grandma, was what happened with those divorce papers. Victoria had framed them, not as a reminder of what almost was, but as a symbol of what love could overcome. She'd written across the top in red ink, "Some promises are stronger than fear." Daniel had found them during one of his visits and asked about them. "I was going to leave him," Victoria had admitted. "I'd finally decided I couldn't live as a secret anymore." "What changed your mind?" Sarah had asked. "You did," Victoria had said simply. "Both of you. In that hospital, I saw how much he loved you, and I realized that his fear wasn't about shame, it was about scarcity. He thought love was something you could run out of. But watching you both fight to understand, fight to forgive, fight to include me, I realized that love is the opposite of scarce. It's the one thing that grows when you give it away." The three of them had started a tradition that would have made Jonathan proud. Every year, on the anniversary of his death, they visited his grave together, then came back to the Malibu house to share stories. Not just the perfect memories, but the complicated ones, the painful ones, the real ones. Because that's what family does, Grandma. Family tells the truth even when it's hard. Grandma, I think about this story a lot because it reminds me of what you always said, that love isn't about being perfect, it's about being brave. Jonathan Blackstone had enough money to buy anything in the world, but he couldn't buy the courage to live his love out loud. Victoria could have stayed bitter. Daniel and Sarah could have stayed angry, but instead, they chose something harder and more beautiful. They chose to build the family that Jonathan had been too afraid to create. Sometimes the most radical thing you can do is forgive. Sometimes the most courageous thing you can do is love someone not despite their flaws, but including them. And sometimes the most healing thing you can do is choose family, not because you have to, but because you want to. Victoria Chen Blackstone learned that love isn't finite, that choosing joy doesn't cost you anything except fear, that it's never too late to live out loud, even if the person who kept you in shadows is no longer there to see it. And maybe that's the lesson in all of this, Grandma, that we honor the people we've lost, not by preserving their mistakes, but by having the courage they couldn't find, by loving openly, by choosing family daily, by believing that there's enough love in the world for everyone who needs it. If anyone reading this has been living in someone else's shadow, or keeping their love secret, or believing that happiness is something they don't deserve, take it from Victoria's story. Love is not scarce. Family is not fragile. And it's never too late to step into the light. Thank you for listening to this story, and if it touched your heart, please subscribe to hear more letters to Grandma. Share your own stories of complicated love in the comments below. Sometimes the stories we think are endings are actually just beginnings in disguise. I love you, Grandma. Thank you for teaching me that the best stories are the ones where people choose love, even when it's scary, even when it's complicated, even when it's too late to do it perfectly. Your grandson.